Well, let's talk about culture. This is our first substantive chapter that we've covered up to this point. And culture is one of those things that's kind of hard to describe because it's really everything in our world. It's the totality of all of our customs, knowledge. Your book does talk about and kind of make this distinction between material and non-material culture. So a lot of things we physically see in our world are part of our culture. So if you think about the McDonald arches or SUVs or that sort of thing, that's something that feels kind of distinctly American. But we also have these non-material aspects of culture, which are our belief systems. So, freedom of religion and freedom of the press, those sorts of things would also be part of our culture. Culture really is everything that gives us that distinctiveness that we feel our culture has. So everything from language to the way that we dress to music, rituals and norms, customs that we have, all those beliefs that make up who we are. You're I think embedded in this book is this assumption or this idea that there's not such a thing as an uncultured world or an uncultured society. Sometimes we talk about people being uncultured, or sometimes we talk about other cultures not having the sort of culture that we have. Your book talks about this idea of ethnocentrism. So I just kind of be aware of that, because sometimes we do hear that from time to time. That these other countries or cultures don't have a semblance of culture, and that's not really the way that sociologists would think about these things. So I'm going to spend most of this talk or this lecture on is a study that's not covered in your book, and that's just to kind of give you more insight or good, which I think is an interesting example of one aspect of culture, which is a subculture, or some people might call it a counterculture. And this is a research article that was written by Catherine Fox, who's a big name in sociology of culture, and as you can tell here, in music subcultures, and specifically punk cultures and countercultures. This is her article called "Real Punks and Pretenders." So her work, she didn't really go into this work with the particular question. She was just interested in exploring the punk world and seeing how the punk world is organized. That's why this is framed as a research goal rather than a research question. But again, she was interested in the social organization of this punk counterculture, which she called a counterculture. And here, these of course weren't punks that she interviewed, but Sid and Nancy, for all you punk aficionados out there. So we'll talk a little bit about the methods that she used. She did participant observation, so you should remember that from the previous chapter. She changed the name of the bar that she attended, but she's referring to it as the Glass Gun. And at this particular bar, there was one night. It was a regular bar, but there was one night where punks kind of convened and I guess took over the bar for that particular night. And she would make sure to go to that bar on that punk night, and she would find that there was this the set of 30 core punks that would be at that bar regularly. So she kind of befriended them and kind of got to know them. And from that, she was able to interview them both formally and informally to get the data, which is the basis of what she presents here in this article here. But she's, like I said, just mainly interested in what makes a punk, and who counts as a punk and who doesn't count. So just that idea of authenticity, really. So what she talked about were there being these two dimensions of cultural distinctiveness for punks. So first is the punk style. So the distinct punk hair styles, mohawks, or this image here is Liberty spikes, in reference to the Statue of Liberty, kind of looks like the Statue of Liberty. And then just the look that the punks had. Some of them had shaved heads, the clothes that they would wear, tattoos, tattered clothes, etc. So that's one dimension of what a punk is. And then secondly was the punk value system. So largely that was this disdain for the system, this kind of live for the moment mentality, and this anti-authoritarianism belief system, and cynicism whenever it did come to the mainstream world and the organization of the mainstream world. So those are the two key dimensions of punk. What you look like and what you believe really is what she's getting at right here. And what she came to find is that not all participants shared both that punk style or that punk value system. That really is the key. To be a punk varied, or your degree of being punk varied on these two dimensions. How much you look like a punk and how much you believed like a punk. And again, that's, as we're going to see, just part of these membership roles. So when she interviewed these punks, they didn't use the group labels that we're going to see here on the next slide, but she created those terms herself just so that we as outsiders and as readers could make sense of this world. But they did talk about the organization in the way that we'll see it here. And like I said, the membership role in this larger punk world was tied to the presence of those two dimensions of being punk, what you look like, what you believed, and also the intensity of them. So were you really amped up in your punk look or kind of dialed it back? Was your punk ideology, 100%, or was that dialed back as well? So the groups or subgroups that she came to realize were at play in the social organization of this punk world started off with what she calls the hardcore punks, and these were the true believers. So these were smallest in number. I usually think about the punk system as kind of like being a pyramid structure where the most committed punks were the smallest in number. They're the smallest number at the peak of the pyramid. So they were smallest in number, but they were certainly the most devout punks. They absolutely embodied that punk lifestyle and that punk look, and they also internalized that punk value system or ideology. So a lot of the interviews with the hardcore punks, they talked about this. They almost had these conversion stories and talk about how they discovered punk, and punk was like a key way of life for them. And how whenever they found the world of punk, they felt like they were finally home. So the sense that that's who I am deep down inside, and that's who I'm always going to be. That large commitment to punk as a aspect of their identities and lives. So the hardcore punks, they didn't feel like their being a punk was temporary, but they felt like, I am going to live my life and I'm going to die punk. I'm going to be this for the rest of my days. So it wasn't a trend, it wasn't just a short-term commitment, but something that was deep down in their bones. And because of that, they had this large, deep commitment to the punk value system, or punk as a cultural movement. And if you walked into the Last Gun, the most salient feature of the hardcores was their physical appearance, because as soon as you saw them, within half a second, you'd realize this person's absolutely a punk. So they would have that punk look, mohawks, Liberty spikes, tattered clothes, safety pins in their ears, that sort of thing, tattoos. So, you would immediately know that they looked like a punk, and that was the defining feature of them, or at least appearance-wise, that was the defining feature of them. One of the interesting items, just as a side note, was that some of the punks had swastikas on them, the Nazi symbol, the swastika, and she was concerned with that. And when she interviewed them, she kind of, of course, asked them about the meaning of their tattoos, and a lot of them said, I'm here as a punk, I'm here to offend and make mainstream society uncomfortable. And the easiest way for me to do that is to have a swastika tattoo. So they would really use these swastika tattoos as a symbol of contempt, not as a, they're being an adherent to white supremacy. So kind of bizarre that's one aspect of some of the hardcore punks, not all of them, but interesting that was one tactic that they used to offend people, is to use the swastika. And then the second group in this hierarchy, I guess, of punks were the softcore punks. So visually, these looked identical to the hardcore punks. So if you walked in the Glass Gun on punk night, you wouldn't be able to differentiate the hardcore punks from the softcore punks because they looked identical. Softcore punks still had that radical appearance, still had the Liberty spikes and mohawks and that appearance. But the difference was in their value system, and they were less committed to punk as an ideology or as a movement. I mean, that's something that you couldn't visually see. That was part of their belief system, part of their internal belief system. They tended not to have this sense of conversion. They didn't really talk about how I'm always going to be punk. I discovered punk, and this is who I have always been deep down inside, and who I'm going to be for the rest of my days. They didn't really have the same sort of concern for punk as a movement or as an ideology, and it was not entirely for fun, but something that if I'm going to do it, I'm going to go all the way. If I'm going to be punk right now, I'm going to look like punk. I'm going to go all the way. But I imagine that I might move on to something else later on in the future. So that's the key distinction. They look like hardcore punks, but they don't believe to the same depth in punk as the hardcores do. But despite that difference, there was still some overlap and acceptance and friendship, I guess, between the hardcore and softcore punks. So they still got along with one another. And then when it comes to the third group, who Catherine Fox labels the preppy punks, we'll see it's a very different situation. So the first difference is that they tended to be younger than the hardcore and softcore punks. So a lot of times they were in their early 20s. They also tended to overwhelmingly be in the middle class. They didn't abandon or reject the system certainly the way that hardcore punks did. They still had these conventional lives. So a lot of the preppy punks sometimes they were college students, or sometimes they were just regular old, white collar workers that had their regular jobs, but they kind of did this punk thing on the side, or they really loved punk music and kind of dabbled in punk, but they didn't look the way and didn't believe the way that the hardcore punks did, or even the softcore punks did. So mainstream, they were mainstream. They were in school. They had regular jobs. And even their appearance was more versatile. They were able to turn punk on and off. So rather than having Liberty spikes or mohawks, they had faux hawks, something where, they could kind of manipulate their hair to look punkish whenever they'd go to the glass gun, but then go to bed, wake up the next morning, basically comb their hair over and look like a, quote, normal middle-class white-collar employee. So not that radical appearance. And there was also what was described as this manufactured quality of their punk look. So whereas the hardcore and softcore punks had tattered clothes and old clothes because they really were old, worn out, hand-me-down, Goodwill clothes, the preppy punks were more likely to buy expensive clothes that were made to look punk. So they'd go to like Hot Topic, places like that to buy their clothes. So not real, not authentic in the eyes of the hardcore and softcore punks. They weren't respected really by the hardcore and the softcore punks. They didn't get along, they weren't really friends. And a lot of times the critique, whenever the hardcore punks especially would talk about the preppy punks, they would say, I'm a punk 7 days a week. I do this 100% of the time, 100% of my life. I don't just do this on the weekend. You can't just buy your way into this culture, this subculture. So interesting, the other interesting thing with the preppy punks is that in some ways having that group in this world or in the glass gun really helped the hardcore punks to kind of emphasize their authenticity, because they're able to point at the preppy punks and say, that's not a real punk. Like, that's not a real punk. I'm a real punk. I believe like a punk and I look like a real punk. So there was kind of this function to having the preppy punks, even though they didn't get along, but it really did help the hardcore punks, especially to just kind of verify their position as the best or most authentic punks. It's an interesting study, interesting to examine music and music cultures as one dimension of our cultural landscape.